Welcome to this post from NZ Astro, the YouTube channel devoted to astrophotography with the Nikon Z series of mirrorless cameras. One of the reasons I like the Z series for mirrorless cameras is its ability to focus very effectively in the dark. You have a handy fold-out screen here and you can use focus peaking in live view on starlight to get your first fix on the stars and then refine it with magnified live view through this screen. And that's a reminder of the fact that astrophotography is essentially a manual focus operation on cameras such as this. Now, that's related to a couple of things that Nikon did when they introduced the mirrorless series. They actually changed the geometry of the interface between the lens and the body. And in particular, the difference between the flange at the front of the body and the sensor inside has come down to 16 millimeters in contrast to the 46.5 millimeters that it was for f-mount lenses attached to DSLRs. Now, Nikon dealt with that through this ingenious device, the FTZ adapter, which amongst other things is an extension tube to make up that 30.5 millimeter change. And what that means is that you can take an f-mount lens and mount it on a Z body through this adapter, which corrects the distance between what this lens is expecting and what this body is providing. Now, this adapter provides a lot of other functionality, in particular the communication of information from the lens to the camera and vice versa, including autofocus and aperture control. Now, in the context of astrophotography, we don't usually need all the functionality of this great gadget. We're always doing manual focus, and a lot of the time we're working wide open, though some people might occasionally stop down a little bit for image quality. So we don't, strictly speaking, need all of this. So it then raises the question of what else can we do with that 30.5 millimeter gap between here and here. And the main purpose of this post is to introduce an alternative concept. And that concept, it's a concept, it's an idea, it's not a product, because you can make it yourself from parts that are available on the internet. I call it FAstroTZ, which means that you're going from an f-mount lens through an astrophotography filter to a Z-mount body. Okay, so let's take a look at what that is in practice. I'll remove the lens from the camera. This works very straightforwardly. Remove the lens like that, detach the gadget from the body like this. What have we got? Well, we've got two pieces to this. It's actually a useful thing that it's made out of two parts. Let's explain what these parts are. First of all, this part here is the Barda wide T-ring for the Nikon Z. It's Barda part number 2408335. What you've got in here is a two-piece part. The outer ring, which attaches to the camera, has got a 52 millimeter dovetail around this region, and it comes with an insert to attach to a T-ring, a standard telescope T-ring. Now, this, I think, is probably the 42 millimeter variety. You can actually replace this with a 48 millimeter insert, but you don't need that for this project. So if you go on the Barda website or to one of their resellers, if you just ask for 2408335, then you will get to this. There are other versions of this for other bodies. Okay, so that's the first part you need. The other part you need is this gadget. And this is the G-Optic CCD Nikon adapter, part number 30A191. There it is. In the box, it comes with some other bits and pieces. You get a foot and some screws to attach that foot, so you can actually use this for its original purpose to mount Nikon lenses on dedicated astro cameras and attach them to a tripod or another dovetail. We don't need that piece. Now what we have here already is a filter inserted into that. This part takes 1¼ inch filters, and what I put in here is actually the Optilong L-Enhance 1.25 inch filter, and that screws in here. It's important that you have it upward facing the gold securing ring for the lens, because you can actually, I made a mistake the first time I had this. I screwed it in this side up close to the sensor, up against the camera. That produced some quite severe mechanical vignetting. The vignetting can be minimised, despite the small size of this, by actually having it face up this side. Okay, so it's really quite easy to sort this out. You screw the barder to this part. Now I've actually got a spacer on here, and I'll come back to that in a moment. You screw that to that part. You attach the lens, and after a bit of practice you learn where everything goes. I've got this white dot up against the nearest to those two screw holes. Put it this way, tighten it, and you have a very secure connection. There's some negative comments about this attachment on the internet. I think it takes a bit of getting used to, but I find it extremely secure, and I'm slightly mystified by some of the negative comments, maybe. It's different from a bayonet attachment. You do have to get used to it. And then there is a handy red dot on here, which you align with the white dot on the body, and then attach those two things. And there you go, that's it. FAstroTZ in place. One other thing you can do, which I've done for this lens here, is to use the screws on the dovetail fitting on here to actually make sure this whole contraption is lined up so that the focus scale is on here and the hood will be in the right orientation so it doesn't obstruct the light. Okay, so that's almost it for the basics. One thing I should say is that the optical length of this barder part is 8.3 millimeters. The optical length of the geoptic is 21 millimeters. Together that makes 29.3 millimeters, and that is 1.2 millimeters short of the flange distance shift, which is dealt with by the FTZ. Okay, so this is slightly narrower than this. To start with, that won't matter, but you will find you have to focus a little bit short of infinity. Now, having this short of the 30.5 is okay, because you can make it up with a spacer. If you went over that 30.5, you would very rapidly lose the ability to infinity focus. So if you want to fine tune things, perhaps to make sure that things are in focus across the whole field of the sensor, and there'll be more of that at the end of the video, you can get these spacer rings. Now, I'm sure any old spacer rings will work. These are the Barder T2 spacer rings, part number 2458102. Yes, I have read that, 2458102. There are 15 rings, 5 sizes, 3 of each, and you can fit them on there to adjust the spacing. I'll explain more about that later, but I would order one of these along with the T-ring, so you've got the opportunity to fine-tune this gadget later on. They're a bit tight to fit on, so I ended up cutting them to slide them over the thread. Okay, so that is FAstroTZ. If that's all you want to know, you can quit this video right away, order some pieces, and order these bits and get on with it. You can also experiment with other combinations. I mean, what you need is something that will talk to a camera, something that will talk to a Z body, and a means of putting a filter in place. This geoptic is nice because the filter placement and the camera adapter come together. I'm not aware of other standalone body connectors other than the Barder, so if you know of something, tell me. There are quite a few products like this. SWO and QHY all make versions of this for their own cameras. I quite like the geoptic one because it comes with the filter holder already in place. Okay, so that is it in short. Now, if you want to go and have a play, just stop here or note where you've got to. But there are a few points of detail here, and this is mainly, well, maybe you're just not as dumb as I can be and won't make the same mistakes, but I found a few things out in the course of putting this thing together and starting to use it, which you may find useful. So if you don't want to make the same mistakes I did, then listen on for a while. Okay, so there's a few things to talk about. Vignetting is one, aperture control is important, fine-tuning your focus, and possible colour fringing management. Okay, but first of all, let me talk about, well, why do you want to do this? What's the point? Well, there's a whole array of astrophotography filters out there which do amazing things, and they tend to come in certain set sizes, like the 1¼ inch optical. This is a 2-inch quad band filter that's through 2 pairs of wavelength selectively, and then you have the more traditional light pollution systems, moon enhancers, planet enhancers, and so on. So there's a huge range of these things that you can get in the Astro format, but not necessarily in any other format. But let's just survey the alternatives to be complete. So first of all, normal photographers stick filters on the end of their lens. Can you do that? Well, the answer is yes, you can, but it's really limited, I think, to a certain context. So can you fit these astro filters on the end of the lens? It's just a matter of having the right parts. What I've done here is take, that's the Altair quad band, and stick it in this Bada filter slider, the UFC 2-inch slider, part 24591112. That fits in the UFC base 245910, and there's actually a part here which is the 72mm filter adapter for this. I don't have the part number of that to hand, but that actually just screws in to the filter on the front of the lens. This is the Samyang 85mm 1.4 for the Z mount. Okay, so that just screws on here. And if you have a look at that, and you put that on here, you can then see, of course, that I have reduced the diameter of that a bit. So is there any kind of an aperture loss? Well, that's one of the things you have to take into account when trying this on the end. In this case, there isn't that much, around 85mm, 135mm perhaps. These things are fine. If you go to much bigger lenses, of course, then obviously you're going to throw away a huge amount of aperture and possibly get vignetting with a small filter on the end of a huge lens like that. So it's got a certain context of operation. If you go to much longer telephotos, then you're going to really decrease the effective aperture and possibly have vignetting. Another point is that this type of lens appears to be a bit fussy. Sorry, this type of filter is a bit fussy about the angle of light that comes in. You've got to bear in mind that all of these astrophotography filters were originally designed for telescope operations, deep sky perhaps, and the light may be coming in directions close to parallel to the axis of the telescope. And a lot of these filters may not care about the angle, but some of them appear to. So if you have light coming in at much more extreme angles, there will be colour changes and the filter won't behave in the same way. The sweet spot for this appears to be around 85, 135, possibly 200 mils, depending on the aperture, in that you're not losing too much of the light that's coming in, and indeed you're not trying to deal with rays that are really off, a long way off parallel to the axis. This gadget really does not materially alter the aperture of this. So, I mean, I hope you can see that. There it is going from maximum to minimum. And in fact, if I put on the 1.8 stop down, you can see that the blades of the aperture ring from the lens rather than anything to do with this filter that I put on. So that's a kind of a sweet spot for this type of operation. But you can't get the you can get bigger lenses, bigger filters, but they're hugely expensive. This is kind of a affordable place to put things. But then when you come to shorter focal lengths, wider angles, then the action of some of these filters can change quite a lot. Okay, so that position is not so good. What do the telescope people do? Well, they put the filter between the telescope. This is a flattener going to a camera body. It's again the Z mount coupling. This is that same filter holder, and they put the filters in this location here. So that goes in here. The filter lives in that space between the camera and the telescope. Okay, so but with the telescope context, there's often a lot of what's called back focus. So this flattener has about 95 millimeters of back focus before it wants to see the sensor, so you can fit all this stuff in here. So that's fine. With a camera, of course, a camera lens, you don't have all this space. We just have the 30.5 millimeters to play with. The other solution that's usually tried is the clip filter. The short story is I'm not aware of much around at all for the Z series because of the change in geometry. I know companies are working on it. Last time I checked, there really weren't a huge number of options. I couldn't see any serious astrophotography options. That may change within weeks, of course. I think that if the whole purpose of this is you can swap these things around just by screwing in one unscrew. If on the other hand you have to go in and fiddle around really close to that sensor, that's fine if you're going to do it, say, once in a blue moon, shoot a lot of photographs with one filter and then perhaps take it off or switch to another filter. If you're trying all sorts of wavelength suppression and light pollution and going in and changing that thing regularly, then you're increasing your chances of fouling up. So that's the point of view. There are some excellent astrophotography filters out there. Some very good companies making them. They're looking at the Z mount, I know, in some cases, and people take wonderful photos with them. It's just not for me. And given that I have telescopes and these standard round things, I want to be able to use the ones I've already bought for my telescope on my camera. Okay, so that's a bit about the whys of this. Let's talk about what happens with vignetting in practice. Let's see if I've got my favourite picture to hand. I hope you can see this. This was taken a couple of days ago in the autumn light, an arboretum near where I live, looking at the Optilong L-Enhance and what it does to the golds of the autumn leaves. It deletes the yellow and leaves all the trees looking rather pink, which is a bit odd, but there's not really much fall off here beyond what you get from shooting with this lens wide open. And this was shot with the 20mm 1.8. And remarkably, provided you get the filter close to the lens, then with this 21.8, the Sigma Art 35, this Sam Liang 12mm fisheye, you can go pretty much to full frame with this and see very little vignetting or fall off, which is good. But there is a certain bit of geometry here. The diameter of these lenses, these filters, is rather less than the diameter of the full frame sensor. So there has to be a problem somewhere. In fact, if you try a big lens like this, the 200 to 500, the further you go up to 500, the more you will generate those black corners. If you're desperate for full frame support, you'll have to wait for the 2-inch filter solution to work on a lens like this. In fact, what I found is every lens I've tried is fine on the 1-to-1 crop built into the Z bodies. So you have that, and I suspect if you have a Z7, the 5-to-4 will be found useful. If you've got the Z50, you just don't have to worry. This is the issues that in the corners are well outside the DX boundary. And if you're doing astrophotography, you may well have already discovered that many lenses are fantastic within the DX zone, but the vignetting and coma kick in when you move from DX to full frame. 1:1's a sweet spot, often even without a filter. The important thing is that you mount that filter this side of the body, this side of the body of the G-Optic, and then that works fine. Okay, that's vignetting, that's the Y and the vignetting done. Let's just think a little bit about the control of the aperture on these things. It's a slightly complicated story because they're all different ways for how the lens manages this. Okay, now, if you take a look at this, there is actually a little pin in here. I hope you can see that. That's the Aperture Control Pin. And that interacts on this 20mm 1.8 Nikon lens. And I'll use the correct technical term, the little black flappy thing on this lens. Let me just make sure I can find it. I hope you can see that. I'm moving this around. This aperture control flap flicks back, and then if it engages with the pin there or is connected to a motor on the body or the FTZ, it is then moved to wherever you want it. Now, the G-Optic's quite cool in this respect because that pin locks the aperture wide open. Let's get my alignment system in place. And hopefully you can see that. And then when you tighten this up, you have this thing locked at wide open. Okay, so that's that. If we just take a look at a lens with an explicit aperture ring, this is the Samyang 12mm fisheye, and this, in common with the Samyangs and indeed the Zeisses, has an aperture ring, and that, hopefully you can see, opens and closes the aperture. Now what you do with this is, if you played with these on F-mount bodies or the FTZ, you'll know that the thing to do is to set it to f22, and then the camera will, have I found the aperture control ring? No, I haven't, that's this one. The camera will then manage this flap. Now on this FAstroTZ, the aperture control pin will activate that. So now with this set to f22, it behaves in exactly the same way as a Nikon. And the other type of aperture control you have to worry about is electronic, like on this 200-500. It's got an E in the name somewhere. There it is, 1 to 5.6 E. This does not have a little black flappy thing. The aperture control is electronic. And in my experience, when you take a lens off a body and power down the body first, the aperture locks down at the minimum size, maximum F number. So that's the opposite of what you want for astrophotography. And the trick that seems to work, and in my experience does no harm, is actually to set the aperture of this when it's on either the FTZ or a DSLR, and then remove it from the body before you turn off the body, and the aperture stays where it was. That's not officially sanctioned, but seems to work. It's at your own risk. It's never been a problem for me. Okay, so those are the various things you can do. For my 2-inch filter project, I'm playing with different adapters that don't have the aperture control pin. They do exist. So if you like stopping down all the time, there may be a way around that. I think if you're putting quite strong filters on a body, you'll want all the light coming through that you can and work wide open. There is a choice to be made there, and one has to figure out how to access that choice in the right way. All right, let's tidy up a bit. So I've tidied up. Hopefully my camera won't drift any further. Let's talk about focusing. So let's just recap. This has got an optical length of 8.3mm. This is 21. We're 1.2 short of the theoretical amount we need. So we could use these spaces that we can put in the barders. 5 sizes, 3 of each. Best cut to fit easily. Now, what spaces do you want to put in? As well as realizing that this may be a bit short, there's 2 things to think about. First of all, despite the fact that we're dealing with Nikon, Bada, Geoptic, all fine engineering companies, everything in life is made within a tolerance. There may be small fluctuations in the gaps at these various joints and in the manufacturing of the parts. That's just life, no matter how good things are. So it may not be exactly 1.2 mils, and so you don't just rush for that space right here. But there's another thing you have to think about, which is the fact that the filter itself changes the focusing properties. Okay, now I'm going to put this out. Please don't panic or throw up. Let's get that centered so we can see it all. Okay, now I'm going to quickly go through this. It's been 40 years since I did my high school optics. Polite comments, please, if I've fouled up. The important thing to realise is that if you have some rays coming into focus without a filter and then you put a sheet of glass in, it actually moves the focus point back, in other words, deeper into the camera. So if you focus the FAstroTZ without a filter in place and then put a filter in place, you would have to bend the light more to bring it back to this point. In other words, you would focus shorter still. Now, what's the scale of this effect? Well, I've done the calculation from scratch myself. I think it's here. You can look at it in detail offline if you like. But basically, if we suppose that the glass has thickness T and refractive index N relative to the air, then you can work out what the shift is exactly. And then for rays which are close to parallel to the axis, you discover that the shift is given approximately by T, the thickness of the glass, multiplied by 1 minus the relative refractive index. And then there are curvature corrections which could cause problems. I'm going to assume these are small. This quantity for glass N is around 1.5. So you'll often hear the rule of thumb quoted, which is that the focus shift is approximately 1/3 the thickness of the glass. Now for filters, how thick are they? For these Optilongs, then I believe they're about 1.8 millimeters thick. So this focus shift is about 0.6 of a millimeter. So it's comparable to the spacing gap we have to deal with. So what do you do? Well, you could do what I call the theoretical economics calculation. Say, well, I know the precise measurements of my parts. I'm 1.2 millimeters short. I know the precise thickness and refractive index. Therefore, I shall add T times 1 minus 1 over N to 1.2, and I shall pick my spacer accordingly. Okay, so the reason I call that theoretical economics is that it's using data you don't necessarily have, ignoring errors and getting the wrong answer. Okay, so what are we going to do instead? Well, the important thing is you realise the main effect of this optics calculation is a bodily shift, a rigid shift back. Okay, so once you figure that out, you can get rid of the horrible maths. What you want to do is, I think, is to calibrate this thing, allowing for the actual length of this part and the actual impact of the filters. The way I think you should do that is to, first of all, take out your lens and body with the ordinary FTZ on board, or if you have an F-mount, a DSLR, try it on there, but ideally with this, and say, and find out, focus on actual starlight, or indeed on some distant trees, where the infinity marker, where the focus marker is when the lens is actually focused on starlight or a distant object. Don't worry about what that marker says. That's a pointless obsession. Worry about where it is, and then put this on there, replace the FTZ by this, put the filter in, and then see whether the focus again on starlight or distant trees and see where the marker is. Now, if it's moved a lot, you will need to put some spacers in, but put the spacers in so as to restore the marker to where it was on the FTZ. And why would you do that? Well, you hope that Nikon's engineers, like any good lens engineer or telescope manufacturer, has organized the focusing system of the lens such that the surface of focus, which is in general curved, is as close to flat as possible when it hits that sensor. That's what you're aiming for here. And because of that bodily shift, due to the filter and also to any actual length specification. You really want to do a bodily shift of this to where it should be, and then you let Nikon's focusing system, which could have internal groups moving against each other, take care of putting the flat focus surface on the sensor. Okay, if you just leave all this out and you focus short, you may get the middle in focus, but the edges may be rubbish. There are all sorts of possibilities here. Because of those uncharacterized curvature effects in the filter, there may be an even better optimal point where you fiddle with the spacers and the focus to get the best possible place. But I would say just restore the location of the infinity marker to where it was, say, on the FTZ, using the spacers. Okay, that's that. Now, there's one final caveat on color fringing. I have to just say that when telescope manufacturers, when filter manufacturers for astrophotography make their filters, they're assuming the context of, often distant objects, rays close to the axis of the telescope, and it's the case that some of those filters may have been engineered for that particular context. There's no guarantee that when you have rays coming in, as was the case when we have the filters on the front, there's no guarantee that when rays are passing the filter at a more extreme angle on their way to the sensor, that a general astro filter will behave in the intended fashion. That may depend on just how much curvature, convexity or concavity there is in the focus of the lens groups at the back of this lens construction. If it's relatively empty space and the light's going parallel, you may be okay. But I think you need to watch out for the fact that being able to do this experiment does not mean that the experiment will cause the filters to behave in this context as they did on a telescope. So I just, if you see some color fringing after trying out something like this, do not be that surprised. If you have something where the action of the filter depends on the angle of incidence, then that is kind of inevitable, and it's too soon to tell, I think, just how much that matters. But I'm sharing an experiment with you here, and I'd be interested to see here, if you try this out, what you find on that front. So that's pretty much it. So we've covered in this second part of the talk vignetting, focusing, aperture control, and possible color fringing. But I hope you have fun with the idea and try it yourself. Please feel free to make comments, preferably kind ones, especially if I've managed to foul up the maths after all these years. But otherwise, happy shooting and clear skies.